The Black Death, one of the most catastrophic pandemics in human history, ravaged medieval Europe between 1347 and 1352, leaving a devastating impact that would resonate for centuries. The pandemic, often referred to as the Great Mortality by contemporaries, claimed an estimated 25 to 30 million lives, nearly half of the population of Europe at the time. The disease is believed to have originated in Central Asia and was carried westward by Mongol traders and warriors, reaching Europe through the Crimean port of Kaffa. Genoese trading ships, carrying infected rats or possibly human parasites, transported the plague from the Black Sea to Italy, where it quickly spread across the continent. The Black Death was caused by a bacillus bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, which was transmitted primarily through fleas that lived on rodents, particularly black and brown rats. While fleas were the main culprits, recent studies suggest that human parasites, such as lice, may have also played a significant role in spreading the disease. The pandemic earned its ominous title due to the blackened skin and sores that afflicted its victims. Other symptoms included fever, chills, joint pain, and swollen lymph nodes, known as buboes. With a fatality rate of up to two-thirds in some areas, the Black Death wiped out between 30% and 50% of the population in the places it touched. The magnitude of death was unprecedented and fundamentally altered the fabric of European society, economy, and culture. The plague's long-lasting effects included labor shortages that contributed to the weakening of the feudal system, widespread social unrest, and a deep questioning of traditional authority, both secular and religious. Entire towns and villages were abandoned, leaving landscapes dotted with empty homes and decaying infrastructure. It would take nearly 200 years for Europe's population to recover to its pre-plague levels. The Black Death, like many great disasters, was not the result of a single cause, but a confluence of factors. The primary agent of the pandemic was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that thrived in the blood of infected animals and was spread by fleas that infested these hosts. The role of the rat, particularly the black rat, Rattus rattus, has been highlighted as a primary vector in spreading the disease. However, recent evidence suggests that human fleas and lice may have played a more significant role in its transmission than previously thought. There are three types of plague: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, and all were likely present during the Black Death pandemic. Bubonic plague, the most common form, caused severe swelling of the lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck, which would darken in color, leading to the name Black Death. These swollen areas, known as buboes, often became blackened due to internal bleeding. Pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs, and septicemic plague, which entered the bloodstream, were much more lethal, often resulting in death within 24 to 48 hours of the onset of symptoms. The pandemic likely began in the remote steppes of Central Asia, where the bacterium Yersinia pestis was endemic among rodent populations. Mongol armies, as they moved westward in the mid-14th century, brought the disease with them. One significant point of transmission occurred during the Mongol siege of the Crimean port city of Kaffa in 1346. According to historical accounts, the Mongols used an early form of biological warfare, hurling the bodies of plague victims over the city walls to infect the inhabitants. From Kaffa, Genoese traders unknowingly carried the disease aboard ships bound for Europe, bringing the Black Death to Sicily by late 1347. Once in Europe, the plague spread with terrifying speed, following the major trade routes that crisscrossed the continent. The disease reached Italy first, then France, Spain, and the British Isles. By 1350, the plague had spread to Germany, Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and Russia. No region was spared, and the dense population centers of cities like Florence, Paris, and London became hotspots of infection. Historical accounts reveal that some cities, like Milan, employed drastic measures to contain the plague, such as walling up infected households, which may have contributed to their relatively lower death tolls compared to other cities like Florence, which was almost entirely devastated. The symptoms of the Black Death were both horrifying and unmistakable. Fever, chills, and excruciating pain in the joints were followed by the appearance of large black or purple sores, particularly in the armpits and groin. Buboes, the swollen and infected lymph nodes that gave bubonic plague its name, became filled with pus and blood, eventually bursting and spreading more infection. In many cases, these sores covered the body, giving the victim a grotesque appearance. Internal bleeding caused black patches on the skin, and the rapid onset of symptoms often left little time for treatment. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, in the preface to his work The Decameron, captured the mood of horror that pervaded Italy during the plague's outbreak. His vivid account describes the city of Florence as a place of despair, where families were torn apart by illness, bodies were left unburied, and societal norms broke down entirely. Boccaccio's description is one of the earliest and most detailed accounts of the Black Death's symptoms and effects. The Welsh poet Juan Gethin also provided a chilling description of the plague's ravages in his homeland. We see death coming into our midst like black smoke, a plague which cuts off the young, a rootless phantom which has no mercy or fair countenance. Woe is me of the shilling in the armpit. It is seething, terrible, wherever it may come, a head that gives pain and causes a loud cry, a burden carried under the arms, a painful angry knob, a white lump. It is of the form of an apple, like the head of an onion, a small boil that spares no one. Great is its seething, like a burning cinder, a grievous thing of an ashy color. It is an ugly eruption that comes with unseemly haste. It is a grievous ornament that breaks out in a rash. The early ornaments of Black Death. These first-hand accounts, alongside many others from across Europe, illustrate the terror that gripped medieval society as the plague spread uncontrollably. The disease struck indiscriminately, killing rich and poor alike, and leaving entire cities deserted. The Europe of the 14th century was a continent already reeling from a series of crises even before the arrival of the Black Death. Environmental changes had led to crop failures, causing widespread famine in 1315 to 1317. Wars such as the Hundred Years' War between England and France had destabilized political structures and drained resources. The once favorable climate had shifted with the onset of what historians call the Little Ice Age, which brought colder, longer winters and shortened growing seasons. By the mid-14th century, Europe was already a continent in turmoil. Prior to the arrival of the Black Death, famine had swept through many regions, leaving populations weakened and vulnerable to disease. War, too, ravaged the land. The ongoing Hundred Years' War between England and France created a breeding ground for chaos, with armies moving across the land, disrupting food production and destroying villages. In this period of uncertainty, the arrival of the plague exacerbated an already dire situation. The disease first made its entrance into Europe through trade routes. Genoese ships, originating from Caffa on the Black Sea, became infamous for being the carriers of the plague. Caffa, a major trading outpost, had experienced a gruesome siege by the Mongol forces. During the siege, in a gruesome turn of events, the Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses into the city to infect the population within. The disease spread rapidly among the citizens of Caffa. The Genoese traders, unknowingly carrying the plague on their bodies and aboard their ships, fled the city to avoid infection. However, they inadvertently brought the pandemic with them. In October 1347, 4 Genoese ships arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina. The crew members, riddled with disease, were near death, and before long, the plague had made its first significant appearance on European soil. From Messina, the disease spread like wildfire. Italy, with its dense population and bustling trade routes, became the epicenter of the pandemic. By the end of 1347, the Black Death had reached the Italian mainland, and from there, it swept across Europe with terrifying speed. The plague's progression was relentless. In 1348, it reached France, Spain, and Portugal. England saw its first cases in the summer of 1348, likely carried by trading ships from France. By the following year, it had ravaged much of the British Isles, Ireland included. The disease also spread to the Scandinavian countries, reaching as far north as Norway and Denmark by 1350. Eastern Europe and Russia were not spared, with plague outbreaks continuing to surface throughout 1350 to 1352. Despite the plague's relentless march, certain areas were less affected than others. Cities such as Milan, for example, managed to escape the worst of the devastation. Milanese authorities took drastic measures to contain the spread of the plague, including walling up entire households when infections were detected, thus preventing the disease from spreading further. The success of these extreme actions was evident in the lower death tolls reported in the city. The arrival of the Black Death only worsened an already dire situation. The plague quickly swept through Sicily and southern Italy before spreading northward. By 1348, the disease had reached France, and by the end of that year, it had crossed the English Channel into Britain. In the years that followed, it moved rapidly across Central and Northern Europe, affecting Germany, Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and finally Russia by 1352. Medieval medical knowledge was severely limited, and doctors were ill-equipped to handle a disease of this magnitude. Treatments were rudimentary, often involving bloodletting, which only weakened the patient further. Religious leaders advised prayer and penance, but as the death toll continued to rise, many began to question the Church's authority. Some medieval physicians, believing the plague was caused by bad air or miasma, advised burning aromatic herbs and flowers, a practice that had little to no effect on the disease but became a common coping mechanism. The sheer number of dead overwhelmed cities and towns, leading to mass graves and bodies being left in the streets. Art from the period often depicted the danse macabre, a grim image of death leading people of all social classes in a final dance to the grave. Faced with an unprecedented health crisis, medieval society scrambled to find solutions. Unfortunately, the medical knowledge of the time was wholly inadequate to deal with the plague. Medieval doctors had little understanding of infectious diseases, and they certainly did not know about bacteria or viruses. The prevailing belief was that the plague was a punishment from God, a divine retribution for the sins of humanity. This belief informed much of the medical response. Without knowledge of germs or bacteria, doctors resorted to rudimentary methods to treat the disease. Bloodletting was a common treatment, as it was believed that draining the patient's blood could balance the humors of the body and thus cure the disease. Other treatments included the application of poultices made of herbs and flowers to the swollen buboes, although this, too, had little effect. Some physicians subscribed to the theory of miasma, the belief that bad air, or miasmas, carried the disease. To combat this, doctors advised people to burn aromatic herbs like lavender, thyme, and rosemary in the hopes of purifying the air. Others believed that bathing in rosewater or vinegar could prevent infection. None of these methods, of course, were successful in stopping the spread of the disease. With no medical solutions in sight, people turned to religion for answers. Churches filled with worshippers, all praying for divine intervention to halt the plague. In many places, flagellant movements emerged. These groups of religious zealots marched through the streets, publicly whipping themselves in a show of repentance, believing that their self-punishment would appease God's wrath. Flagellants gained significant followings in Germany, the Netherlands, and France, though the Church eventually condemned the movement for its radical nature. Despite the prayers and extreme penances, the plague raged on, unaffected by the actions of man. Among the most recognizable symbols of the Black Death is the figure of the plague doctor. These physicians, often depicted in long, dark robes with a beaked mask, became an iconic image of the pandemic, though the infamous plague doctor uniform was actually a later development, originating in the 17th century. However, the reality of the medical profession during the Black Death was far less organized or effective than these depictions suggest. Medieval doctors, who adhered to the medical theories of ancient figures like Hippocrates and Galen, had little understanding of the actual causes of the disease. They believed that the plague was caused by an imbalance of the body's humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or by miasmas, harmful vapors emanating from decaying matter. To treat the plague, they employed a range of ineffective and often dangerous methods, including bloodletting, purging, and the use of various herbs and potions. The iconic beaked mask, designed to hold aromatic substances like herbs or vinegar, was intended to protect the wearer from the miasmas believed to carry the disease. Though plague doctors became associated with the Black Death in popular imagination, they were more of a symbolic figure than an actual solution to the crisis. In reality, medical practitioners were as helpless as the rest of society in the face of the pandemic. Religion, an omnipresent force in medieval Europe, took center stage as people grappled with the sheer terror and destruction of the Black Death. The pandemic was widely viewed as divine punishment for the sins of mankind, and this belief deeply influenced the behavior of individuals and communities alike. People turned to the church in their desperation, seeking answers to why such calamity had befallen them. Yet, in many cases, the church, which had been the unshakable pillar of society, faltered under the weight of the pandemic. Many priests and monks died from the plague as they tended to the sick, leaving entire congregations without spiritual leadership. This mass exodus of clergy, particularly in hard-hit areas like Italy and France, sowed fear and disillusionment among the populace. The faithful sought solace in prayer, confession, and rituals, hoping that acts of piety could stave off the plague. In some regions, the church's response was more severe. Religious leaders urged their followers to undergo penance, arguing that humanity's sins had brought on this divine punishment. Sermons across Europe echoed with themes of judgment, wrath, and repentance. The Catholic Church organized processions where believers would march through the streets, singing hymns and praying for God's mercy. One of the most extreme manifestations of this religious fervor was the rise of the flagellant movement. Flagellants were groups of radical Christians who believed that the Black Death could only be halted if they undertook extreme acts of self-punishment. These groups, most notably active in Germany, Hungary, and the Low Countries, would travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in an effort to atone for their sins. They believed that by physically punishing their bodies, they could appease God's anger and bring an end to the plague. The flagellants typically marched in processions, barefoot and dressed in white robes. They would stop in town squares or churches to whip themselves, often while singing hymns or chanting prayers. Their public displays of penance drew large crowds, and for a time, they garnered a significant following. People saw them as religious heroes, figures willing to endure great suffering to protect the community. However, the flagellant movement was not without controversy. As the groups grew more extreme, they began to act independently of the church, often criticizing its clergy for their perceived corruption and failure to protect the people. The church, in turn, condemned the flagellants, fearing that their radical practices would further undermine the established religious order. In 1349, Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull condemning the flagellant movement and excommunicating its leaders. Despite this, the flagellants remained active for several more years, before fading from prominence by the early 1350s. As fear and panic spread alongside the plague, communities across Europe began searching for someone to blame for the catastrophe. In times of crisis, marginalized groups often become scapegoats, and the Black Death was no exception. Jews, in particular, faced widespread persecution during the pandemic. Rumors circulated that Jews were responsible for spreading the disease by poisoning wells and rivers. These accusations led to a wave of violence against Jewish communities. In 1348 and 1349, pogroms broke out in cities such as Strasbourg, Basel, and Mainz, where entire Jewish communities were massacred. In many cases, Jewish families were forcibly driven from their homes, tortured into confessing to crimes they had not committed, and burned at the stake. Despite efforts by Pope Clement VI to protect Jewish communities by issuing papal bulls condemning the violence and declaring the accusations false, the persecution continued. The massacres and expulsions were often driven by a combination of religious fervor, economic envy, and political opportunism. In some towns, local authorities and noblemen took advantage of the situation to seize Jewish property and cancel debts owed to Jewish moneylenders. This economic motive, combined with the deep-rooted social prejudices against Jews, fueled the violence. Other marginalized groups also became targets of suspicion: lepers, beggars, and foreigners. Anyone who stood out or appeared different were often blamed for spreading the plague. In some places, leper colonies were burned to the ground, with their residents inside, in a misguided attempt to stop the spread of disease. The Black Death, in its devastation, unleashed some of the worst aspects of human behavior, as fear overrode reason and compassion. The social and economic structures of Europe were irreversibly altered in the wake of the Black Death. Before the plague, Europe operated under a rigid feudal system in which peasants, or serfs, worked the land owned by lords in exchange for protection and a portion of the harvest. The system had functioned for centuries, providing a stable hierarchy that kept the population in relative balance. However, the devastation caused by the Black Death shattered this equilibrium. As the plague ravaged cities and villages, killing as much as 1/3 to 1/2 of the population in some areas, the demand for labor skyrocketed. Fields lay fallow, and the survivors, particularly peasants, found themselves in a new position of power. Landowners, desperate to keep their estates running, had no choice but to offer better wages and conditions to the few remaining workers. In many regions, peasants were able to demand higher pay and, in some cases, freedom from serfdom altogether. This shift in the balance of power between lords and peasants marked the beginning of the decline of feudalism in Europe. While the feudal system did not disappear overnight, the economic upheaval caused by the Black Death weakened its foundations. The labor shortages also led to technological innovation in agriculture, as landowners sought new ways to maximize productivity with fewer workers. The use of tools such as the heavy plow and the horse collar became more widespread, allowing for more efficient farming practices. At the same time, the rise of a more mobile workforce gave birth to a new class of wage laborers. In cities, artisans, merchants, and craftsmen who survived the plague often found themselves in a position of relative economic prosperity. As the population began to recover in the decades following the Black Death, urban centers saw a revival of trade and commerce. This period of economic recovery laid the groundwork for the growth of the middle class and the eventual transition from a feudal economy to a more market-based system. The impact of the plague on feudalism was perhaps most clearly seen in England, where the labor shortage led to widespread peasant revolts. The most famous of these was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which English peasants rose up against oppressive taxation and the feudal system itself. Although the revolt was eventually suppressed, it signaled a growing discontent with the old social order and foreshadowed the changes that would come in the centuries ahead. The Black Death left an indelible mark on the culture and art of medieval Europe. Faced with such unprecedented death and suffering, artists, writers, and musicians sought to express their grief, fear, and attempts to understand the catastrophe. This period saw the emergence of darker, more macabre themes in art, literature, and music, reflecting the profound impact the plague had on the collective psyche. One of the most striking cultural responses to the plague was the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death. This artistic motif became widespread in paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts across Europe. The Danse Macabre depicted a procession of people from all walks of life. Kings, nobles, peasants, clergy, being led to their graves by skeletons or personifications of death. It emphasized the idea that death was the great equalizer, sparing no one, regardless of social status or wealth. The imagery served as a reminder of mortality and the fleeting nature of life, which resonated deeply in a world where death was omnipresent. In addition to the Danse Macabre, other forms of art during this period became heavily infused with death symbolism. Religious art, in particular, took on a somber and apocalyptic tone. Scenes of the Last Judgment, the crucifixion, and images of saints interceding on behalf of the living became more common as people sought spiritual solace. Churches commissioned altarpieces and frescoes that reflected the growing anxiety about salvation and the afterlife. The art of the Black Death era often portrayed angels, demons, and the Day of Judgment with stark realism, embodying the despair and hope of a society grappling with the enormity of loss. In literature, writers responded to the plague with works that captured the emotional and philosophical turmoil of the time. One of the most famous literary pieces from this period is Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written between 1349 and 1353. The Decameron tells the story of a group of young people who flee Florence to escape the plague, and while in isolation, they pass the time by telling stories. The work is notable for its vivid descriptions of life during the plague, as well as its exploration of themes like love, fate, and human resilience in the face of disaster. In England, the poet William Langland wrote Piers Plowman, a lengthy allegorical poem that criticized the corruption of the church and the social upheaval caused by the plague. Although the poem was written in the 1370s, its themes reflect the disillusionment that many felt in the wake of the Black Death. Langland's work, like much of the literature from this era, reflects a deep concern with morality, justice, and the meaning of suffering. Music, too, was affected by the trauma of the Black Death. Medieval hymns and chants often took on a mournful, penitential tone, and compositions like the Dies Irae, Day of Wrath, became central to religious services. The Dies Irae, a part of the Requiem Mass, was a haunting piece that described the Last Judgment, and it became associated with the collective grief and fear experienced during the pandemic. This period also saw the rise of lamentations and other forms of dirge-like music that sought to capture the sorrow and uncertainty that permeated society. The Black Death's immediate impact on Europe was one of death, suffering, and social chaos. But in the long term, the pandemic brought about profound and lasting changes to European society. In many ways, the devastation of the plague paved the way for the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance, a period of renewed interest in art, science, and humanism. One of the most significant long-term effects of the Black Death was the decline of the feudal system, which had been the dominant social and economic structure in Europe for centuries. As previously discussed, the massive loss of life created a labor shortage that allowed peasants to demand higher wages and better working conditions. Over time, this shift contributed to the gradual erosion of serfdom and the rise of a more market-based economy. The Black Death also altered the relationship between the church and the people. While the church remained a central institution in European life, its failure to provide answers or protection during the plague led many to question its authority. This disillusionment with the church would later contribute to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, as reformers like Martin Luther sought to challenge the corruption and power of the Catholic hierarchy. In addition to the social and religious changes, the Black Death also had a profound impact on the intellectual and philosophical landscape of Europe. The trauma of the pandemic led to a growing emphasis on individualism and a questioning of established norms and traditions. This intellectual shift laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, during which thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Galileo would challenge old ways of thinking and push the boundaries of art, science, and philosophy. The pandemic also reshaped Europe's demographics and urban landscapes. Many cities were left depopulated, with entire neighborhoods abandoned and falling into ruin. However, in the decades following the plague, these cities began to recover and, in some cases, flourish. The rebuilding process, along with the rise of new trading routes and economic opportunities, contributed to the growth of powerful city-states in places like Italy and the Netherlands. In the end, the Black Death was a devastating pandemic that left deep scars on European society. But it also led to profound changes that would shape the course of European history. The plague may have wiped out half of Europe, but it also paved the way for a brighter future. The fear and trauma of the pandemic were passed down through generations, shaping the way people thought about disease, death, and the fragility of life. Even centuries later, the Black Death would remain a symbol of human vulnerability in the face of uncontrollable forces, a reminder of the precariousness of existence in a world where life could be snuffed out without warning. So, what did you find most surprising about the Black Death? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to explore more of history's dark secrets, subscribe to be notified of my next video, where I'll be diving into another fascinating topic.